Hello and welcome. My name is Anna Meyer. I'm an environmental analyst at New England Interstate's headquarters in Lowell, Massachusetts. Our speakers, Christiana Pollack and Jessica Jerry, were part of a team that conducted the flood mitigation assessment they'll be describing. They are both certified floodplain managers. The assessment was performed by Princeton Hydro and GreenVest with a grant from New York DEC's Hudson River Estuary program. NEIWPCC managed the grant.
Thanks, Anna, and good morning to everybody. So Jessica and I will be speaking about a flood assessment performed on the lower Moodna Creek watershed. Before we begin, just a little bit of an intro about each of us. I am an ecologist working for Princeton Hydro. We're a water resources firm that focuses on environmental restoration and water resources engineering. I specifically focus on environmental restoration and floodplain management, and with a focus of both riverine and coastal flooding in existing and future conditions. And Jessica?
I'm Jessica Jerry. At the time that Christy and I did this project, I worked with Princeton Hydro as a planner in their office working on flood risk management, hazard mitigation, and other land use planning-related projects. I've since left, and I'm now with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, Office of Coastal Land Use Planning, and I'm a project manager still working on flood risk management with more of a focus on coastal projects and looking at future risk and future conditions.
Okay, so going back to why we're here. As Anna said, this project was performed under a grant offered through the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Hudson River Estuary program, in collaboration with NEIWPCC. The grant's primary goals were to assess flood vulnerabilities and propose flood mitigation solutions that consider two types of strategies. The traditional strategy is engineering, so what roads would need to be addressed, what kind of culverts, either with stream crossings, do they need to be expanded or not to address flooding. But then uniquely, they've also added an approach to natural system solutions. This includes approaches as land preservation or wetland and forest restoration. So this was a great opportunity to think beyond just the traditional engineering methods for flood risk management. It was a chance to really look at using the natural environment to reduce risk. Ultimately, the project fostered strategic thinking about ways to use natural systems, and natural systems also include green infrastructure, stormwater management, and watershed management. So we're not focusing on just the river itself, but everything draining to the river. The ultimate goal is to reduce the flooding risk for both existing and future conditions, which was a big part of this project. It's not only look at today and what's at risk, but looking in 50 years at what's also at potential risk. It should be noted there were consulting partners on the project, Town of New Windsor, Town of Cornwall, Village of Cornwall and Hudson, Village of Woodbury, Orange County Planning, and the Moodna Creek Watershed Council. I can't say enough about how important it was to have the consulting partners involved, and their dedication was a testament to the success of the project. Because of the Moodna Creek Watershed Council that met quarterly, in addition to our meetings, they all have working relationships with one another. They communicate. They're interested in a regional approach, much more than just looking at the municipality, and it made the project very successful and smooth. Okay, so more about the project. We've been talking about the Moodna Creek. Where is the Moodna Creek? So Moodna Creek is in Orange County, New York. In the lower right-hand screen, you can see in state view, it's the red blob. The Moodna drains to the Hudson River. It's approximately 55 miles north of the Battery in New York City. The entire watershed encompasses 22 municipalities, so it's a very large municipality with very large watershed with a lot of moving pieces to it. The watershed has been broken down into two segments, the upper Moodna Creek watershed and the lower Moodna Creek watershed. Our project focused on the lower Moodna Creek, and that's what's highlighted in red on the screen. The lower Moodna Creek watershed is approximately 30% of the entire watershed study area. We should note that the upper watershed was studied as part of the New York Rising project, which ultimately led to us, selecting Moodna, the lower portion for this project, to create a watershed-wide plan. And there we go. Okay. So in addition to the upper Moodna being studied by a previous project, which made studying lower Moodna ideal to create this master plan, there was also flooding issues in the lower Moodna Creek, which brought our attention to it. In the time span of 15 months, the areas were hit with Lee, Irene, and Sandy, which were all very large storms. Particularly Lee and Irene were very large and damaging for the area. The area experienced infrastructure damage, including a bridge that collapsed during the flooding, and inoperable wastewater treatment plants, which were very severe and left untreated sewage being discharged to the rivers. Everybody, a lot of the constituents in the areas are very concerned about flooding. These were large events, but there's also an understanding that large events may become more normal in the future. And so for this reason, the towns and the municipalities and the watershed group were very interested in this study and moving forward. So the project objectives that we were shooting, or that were the focus of this project, were three parts. So to identify flood-prone areas, to identify areas at risk, and develop risk reduction strategies. And we'll go into each of these in significant detail, but this is the bigger picture and what frames the direction of the project. So the first area of identifying flood-prone areas included two parts. The first part was a visual assessment. So we went out in the field right in the beginning of the project and identified, identified sites that we wanted to visit. We pre-selected sites based on existing flood models that FEMA had made, and also areas that we know that were harder hit during Irene and Lee. Visited sites, we took a general survey of topography in the area, get a feeling for what kind of elevations we were dealing with in the watershed. We were looking at flow constriction, so how quickly was water moving along, and were there constrictions under bridges or stream crossings that were creating flooding issues. We were also looking at the development of the floodplain, so were there homes up adjacent to the stream, or they set back, and was the floodplain connected to the channel? So what that means is when it rains and the channel rises because the water surface rises, are the flows going out of bank into the floodplain, or are they staying in the channel and increasing flow? There's two pictures here. The top picture, sort of testament to what the topography is like in the area. It's a very steep, mountainous watershed. In many areas, the Moodna Creek is sort of hugged by these steep valley walls. And what you're seeing in that picture is actually a valley wall failure where it's slowly been eroding away. During our visual assessment, when we saw these kind of conditions, we knew immediately we needed to get a geomorphologist involved in the project, because this was more than just flooding issues. We were also dealing with channel instability questions. And then in the lower picture, you can see this is a flow constriction that we're observing. What's interesting, this was actually a fairly newly constructed culvert, and then during a base flow, there was maybe 18 inches of conveyance for water to flow under. So we took this field information and the field knowledge, so we had a better idea of what type of watershed we were working with. But the next step is really to understand where flooding was happening. And to help with that, we used modeling. Many people might be familiar with FEMA modeling, which maps the 1% storm and the 0.2% storm. In these areas, the FEMA modeling was older. A lot of the flow data is from the 80s, and the maps are out of date. So what we propose to do with this project is to understand the hydrology and hydraulics of the situation while using some of the existing data, because there were some budgetary constraints. The three storms we were modeling were the 10%, the 1%, and the 0.2%. For those of you that are more familiar with year recurrence intervals, this is the 10% is the 10-year, the 1% is the 100-year, and the 0.2% is the 500-year storm. We shy away from using the 100-year versus 500-year terminology because it can be very, very misleading. Many people interpret a 100-year storm as only happening once every 100 years, where really it's statistical probability. So each year annually there's a 1% chance of a storm of that size occurring, and it's independent of the year before. So like I said, we started out with the FEMA data. Oftentimes, like I said, the FEMA data was older, and there was also many significant tributaries in the Moodna Creek watershed that weren't mapped at all. So we had to bring the watershed up to the 21st century, bring the modeling up to the 21st century. And there's a lot of information I'm just going to say on this one slide, and the modeling itself could be an entire presentation on its own, so if you have questions, feel free to ask me later. But basically, we use flows, we used some of the geometry information from FEMA data and updated everything into a one-dimensional steady state model in HEC-GRAPH. We didn't have the scope to develop the hydrology, which is why we used FEMA data. For the original FEMA flows, stream stats data was also used in areas where FEMA data didn't exist. Ultimately, looking back, a two-dimensional model would have been preferable, especially when we want to evaluate mitigation strategies, but due to hydrology constraints, we didn't have that opportunity. But that would be sort of looking back what we would do differently next time. So we looked at the 10%, 1%, and 0.2% storms, and we did this for both existing conditions and future conditions. What's very advantageous in New York, the New York DOT, in collaboration with the USGS, have developed a tool to identify future flow conditions depending on various greenhouse gas emissions. The tool itself is very similar to StreamStats, if you're familiar with StreamStats. And based on which selection of the greenhouse gas emissions you choose and what time interval, you're left with this flow data that we could put into HEC-GRAPH and update the modeling for, we selected 2050 and 2100. We also incorporated into the model population growth. This is something the USGS tool does not incorporate population growth. It's primarily focused on an increase in precipitation. So population growth was, in a very simply way, correlated to impervious cover, and the land cover was updated to essentially increase the runoff and the amount of water that would be entering the stream as a result of population growth. Orange County is a growing county. It's sort of an up-and-coming suburb of New York City, believe it or not. So population growth is an issue and will contribute to future flow conditions. So that's, like I said, a lot of information on one slide. All right. There we go. So here's an output of what the modeling looked like. On the top, we have the 10% versus the 0.2% storm. And on the left, you see a significant difference between the 10% and the 0.2% storm. Whereas on the right side, top right screen, there's not a significant difference in the floodplain footprint between the 10 and 0.2%. And that is really a testament to the topography and its valley walls that are keeping the channel within its footprint. And then on the bottom of the screen, we have the 0.2% storm and existing versus future conditions. And a similar situation is what we were seeing in the existing conditions, different size storms. On the left-hand side, there is a significant difference in the flood inundation of 0.2%, whereas on the right-hand side, there's almost no difference between the two conditions. This was very interesting and challenging of how to approach planning and the mitigation strategies. In some ways, we knew there were areas where there were steep valley walls. We didn't have to be as concerned with flooding because the channel was going to keep the flow within it. But in areas where there is a significant difference between the storm sizes or existing versus future conditions is ultimately where we end up focusing our mitigation strategies, because those are the areas that are at higher risk. So we did a similar survey of everywhere in the watershed to help determine the next steps of the project. Before we did that, we also identified areas that are at risk. And I'll let Jessica speak to that.
So as Christy sort of alluded to, the first step of the project was really trying to get a characterization of the watershed to really understand how, when it rains, does the river run through? Where do we see it leave its banks, if at all? Where is it very steep and creating high velocity flows that can be incredibly destructive? Just looking at kind of the natural conditions. And then looking at areas at risk as opposed to flood-prone areas is looking at where does that flooding become problematic. So where is the development interface with sort of the natural hydrology of the watershed. So we were looking at the facilities, the infrastructure, the development. As Christy mentioned, one of the things that was specifically called out in the grant was to look at stream crossings. So we suspected going into this project that they were looking at some backflooding issues where there was flow constrictions. So when we started looking at the facilities, we were looking at sort of a traditional narrow definition of critical facilities, your emergency response, your treatment plants type of infrastructure that if they get flooded is very disruptive to emergency management in and after the storm. There were only 2 facilities that we came across that were within the floodplain, the identified floodplains that had been affected by the storms that we were looking at, but the Salisbury Mills Fire Department was also identified as a 3rd critical facility that may have flood risk on the map. It was not, as far as we are aware, it's not experienced any damage during the storm. Our partners indicated that they were not aware of any damage that it experienced during the storm. By contrast, as Christy alluded to, both of the treatment plants were affected in the storms. And you can see that's the Cornwall wastewater treatment plant there circled, and it is within the 10% floodplain, which means that in addition to Irene and Lee and the larger storms, there's a chance that it's going to be affected by severe rainfall that may not be of that same caliber. And you can sort of see the picture below of that it's in the low-lying land. And there's, the obvious reason water treatment plants often are adjacent to streams in order to have access to the discharge. There's also within this particular topography of this watershed, one of the challenges in a mountainous area is that there are not an abundance of land that is developable. And so often, too often perhaps, the default and the easiest developable land is the land that's at risk. In this case, it was more likely the proximity to the mouth of the river that was why the treatment plants were sited where they were. There we go. So as I said, we were also looking at stream crossings. This is something that when we went out in the field, we were looking at to had sort of pre-identified areas based on the mapping that might be show. And we were looking for two primary types of stream crossings. The most common ones are culverts, which pass the water from stormwater management underneath a road or some other type of land that needs to be channelized, or a bridge. And so you can see examples of both of those. On the lower left, you can see where the mapping indicates that the constriction is severe and results in back flooding. So the sort of expansive floodplain that is in the yellow, that increases in the 500-year in the 0.2%, is due to that constriction. And so that's really what we were looking at is, you know, in an area where some of the infrastructure is older, where there's not culvert ordinances and other regulations, are there crossings that, if the opportunity is available, should be increased? Of course, when you're looking at increasing culvert sizing or conveyance in general, which we'll talk about in future slides, you do want to always be conscious of how that's going to impact downstream. But at this point, we were just looking at where crossings were problematic within the watershed. There were 5 stream crossings that were identified through the mapping as being particularly notable for their backflooding conditions, and that would get exacerbated under larger storms. We were also looking at land cover. In addition to sort of understanding the characterization of the watershed in terms of topography, it's important to get a good sense of the land cover of the watershed because it matters in terms of how much runoff you're experiencing. Obviously, a more forested watershed, a less developed watershed, you're going to experience less runoff, and theoretically, consequently, you're going to experience less flooding. In urbanized areas, you have to have more mitigation options and opportunities to make sure that that flow that is no longer being captured by the ground is not causing flooding of developed areas. So it's a heavily forested watershed. Development is extremely concentrated, again, because of the topography. There's areas, only a few areas that are really developable. And so, you know, a good percentage of the watershed is forested, and it's got extended areas of undeveloped area, which actually just sort of alludes to the fact that at this point, the flooding in this area is not as bad as it could be under different development conditions, which sort of played into, as we were thinking about mitigation strategies, not just reducing the anticipated floods under future conditions, but also making sure that flooding in this area doesn't get worse by design, making sure that there are, in advance of future development or future changes within the watershed, that we're putting appropriate regulations or appropriate guidance in place to limit the impacts that future development would have on exacerbating flood conditions within the area. And the other thing we wanted to look at, again, looking at sort of the interface between the developed area, what would be flooded, and sort of the flood conditions in general, want to be looking at zoning. So not just what is existing development, but what could be future development going forward. And so this slide gives a sense of what the overall zoning and where it was within the floodplain, and you can see that for the most part, most of the residential zoning was not within the floodplain. However, it should also be noted that a good percentage of the floodplain is zoned for residential. Over 50% was zoned for residential, which meant, again, that under future conditions, in certain situations, there may be significantly worse flooding going forward if the communities in this area are not cognizant of the impacts of regulations on flood conditions. So looking at also not just what the existing land use is, but where future development is likely and is likely not to happen. So although a large percentage of the floodplain is zoned for residential, it's also really important to get a sense of where that development is less likely to occur. A good percentage of the watershed is preserved. It was about 30%, I believe, of the watershed is reserved. 10% of the floodplain is reserved. And there's a lot of value in preservation of land. It's probably one of the best mitigation strategies in an area that has sort of this growing watershed at this point. Preserving land, obviously you're preventing at-risk development from going into flood-prone areas. You're also increasing the ability of the land to capture the runoff and precipitation to reduce the flow that goes into riverines during a storm event. So it's certainly as ecologists and planners, it's our preferred method. It's not always one that watersheds are able to take advantage of. So to find a watershed that was already doing such a great job in land preservation, we wanted to make sure we were looking at opportunities to further that trend within the watershed as they continue to develop. And then, of course, looking at where are the commercial and residential developments within the watershed. So there were 240 buildings within the existing 1%. 100 of those were within the 10%. So again, it was older FEMA data that those numbers may not be exact if FEMA were to come in and remap the study, or if someone else were to come in and remap the study with flow data. But as it stands, based on the data that was available, that's what we were looking at. And looking at commercial and residential development within this type of study is also really data dependent, not just on the flood data that you have available, but on the building data. So there were no building footprints available for this watershed, unsurprisingly. So what we were really doing was hand counting the buildings based on aerial photography. And so there's potentially a little bit of error and challenge in making sure that that is accurate. But it gives you a good sense of the scale of the risk in terms of whether it's large areas of the towns or if it's just small neighborhoods, particular neighborhoods that were at risk, which was the case within this watershed. Sort of in the same vein as the other statistics, because of the way that the topography is, there were areas where, large parts of the river were very channelized and there was not a lot of flood risk. And then once it hit a low-lying area that had already been developed, because that was an easily developable area, those houses were either more at risk or likely to see more flooding going forward. And so as Christy mentioned, those were the areas that we were really focused on in terms of risk reduction strategies. So these are just risk reduction strategies in general that one considers when looking at floodplain management within a watershed. Thinking about none of these pictures, just as an important note, none of these pictures are actually from the Moodna. So when you see the damage, this is not of this actual watershed, but just pictures that represent these typical strategies that are used in watershed management. And there are other strategies that exist, but these were the ones that we focused on for this particular watershed project. So looking at increasing floodplain storage. Again, because you're looking at the difference between the 10% and the 0.2%, we're trying to figure out whether there are areas that can hold greater flows during those large events. So are there areas that existing wetlands could be expanded? Are there areas where there's undeveloped land and the channel can be expanded? And trying to reduce backflooding and overbanking, directing the flows and the flooding away from developed areas, and trying to engineer the system to allow for the flooding we know is going to happen in areas that are not going to put development at risk. And then, as we mentioned, looking at the culverts and the bridges, what we're really looking at in terms of mitigation strategy is increasing conveyance. So where there are constrictions, where those passages for the stream flow are too small, can they be expanded that allows the channel to continue to flow with less constriction, less obstruction, and that limits backflooding into developed areas. This is always an important mitigation strategies if you notice that you're having roadways that are flooded or areas that are adjacent to major intersections. And then moving away from kind of the larger engineering strategies into some of the more smaller opportunities. One of the important ones for this particular watershed that we thought was significant to highlight is stormwater management. The majority of the watershed the majority of the urbanized area of the watershed is covered by MS4 permits, so there is stormwater regulation and management within the developed areas, but that is limited. It is not universal within this area to have stormwater ordinances. There's a lot of opportunity for mismanagement of stormwater in development. And again, with the area growing, we wanted to make sure that best practices were acknowledged. Stormwater management is often thought about in areas like this where you're trying to sort of preempt flood conditions as areas urbanize. It can also, of course, be used to try to reduce impacts in areas that are redeveloping. And in looking at sort of natural solutions, trying to, of course, advocate and look at utilizing green infrastructure techniques instead of just the traditional stormwater management of getting the flows away from developed areas as fast as possible. Obviously, going back to the idea that land preservation in this area is already seems to be a priority or a value based on existing land preservation. We are looking at opportunities for additional land preservation in trying to figure out where preserved land could best reduce future flooding conditions. Obviously, land preservation preserves the hydrologic and ecological function. It provides natural stormwater management, and as we mentioned before, it limits the risk of exposure. But there's also areas in which it's the most applicable or would offer the most benefit in terms of flood mitigation. And then development of development regulations as another just general good practice to make sure that as the watershed continues to grow, there is an increased attention paid to not exacerbating future conditions. So there's an abundance of development regulations. I'm not going to get into all of them, but it's a general strategy that's used, obviously. And then we were also looking at individual property mitigation, and I don't know that any of the project sites that we'll highlight on this, yes, so we'll highlight project sites that looked at individual property mitigation as an option, but generally in areas where some of the larger engineering are not cost-effective or not feasible, the best action is really to work with property owners and help reduce their risk on the site by either moving the structure up above the floodwaters, moving it to another location that is outside of the flooded area, or flood-proofing the structure itself.
Okay. So far what we've done, we've gone through, we've characterized the watershed, we've identified what's at risk, and then we've also developed the type of mitigation strategies to apply to the watershed, knowing what our conditions were. So the next step was to actually identify 16 project sites and apply the mitigation strategies. So this project, we selected 16 sites. We had stakeholder input along the way. So throughout the project, we were continually meeting and communicating with the stakeholders with their information, and they were wealth of knowledge all the time. After we selected the sites, we performed a desktop analysis of the flood mapping, land use, hydrology, and future conditions. This helped to actually select some of the 16 sites. So if you remember earlier, in those areas where the floodplain differed significantly between existing and future conditions, or between the 10% and the 0.2% storm, those are the areas we were focusing, because that's where the land was low-lying and the flood extents were more significant. After we identified the 16 sites, we had to select the appropriate mitigation strategy from the list that Jessica had just went over, and then evaluate the effect of that mitigation strategy. It's really easy to say that a mitigation strategy is going to fix everything, and then you walk away and you leave the town with a piece of paper. So what was great about this project is we took it to the next level to say, okay, we propose this mitigation strategy. How effective is it going to be at reducing your flood risk? And then in combination with that, we performed a rough cost estimate, an order of magnitude cost estimate. So ultimately, at the end of the day, these towns, this watershed group, would be left with a plan that could be applied and implemented, and we're leaving it to them to prioritize what projects they want to go forward with based on funding in part. So I'm going to go through a couple of the sites, not all 16, but just to give an example of some of the mitigation strategies that we proposed. This first site is the Silver Stream wetland area. It's a large expanse of wetland that is partially protected. However, a fair amount of it, parts of the wetland have been feeling development pressure over the last few years. And so we were interested in knowing if this wetland were to be developed while still conveying, the 1% flow in the channel, what kind of implications would this have to downstream communities? We looked basically with the development, there was a 1,500 acre-feet of storage loss. That water has to go somewhere. It's going to go into the channel and downstream. So what does that do to your flood elevations? Well, we saw when you developed the developed the stream, you had a 42% increase in peak flows, which ultimately finished with a 3-foot rise in your water surface elevation. Say you're a homeowner, that 3 feet is pretty significant. The flooding never reached your house before, and then suddenly you have a couple of feet in your house. You've got issues, and nobody wants to have flooding in their home. This strategy is it's invaluable to look at preservation strategies. I can't speak to it enough because everybody wants to save the wetland because it's a wetland and it should be saved. But if you look at this from another perspective, this wetland is providing an important flood storage function right now to the community, and that would be lost if it were developed. Next strategy was increasing conveyance. Jessica touched on this a couple of times. And there were a couple of the projects, I think 2 or 3 of the project sites, 5 of the project sites, but ultimately we were proposing an increase in the stream crossing. In this particular example, we have the 1% storm, which is in yellow, and the future 0.2% storm in red. You can see that in future conditions, the number of homes that will be impacted by the flooding will increase because of the backflooding issue with the culverts. So we went through in our model and we said, all right, what happens if you take that existing culvert and you expand it by 4 feet and increase it by 2 feet? So the final dimensions of the culvert would be 16 feet by 7 feet, which isn't unrealistic for a culvert. We had to stay, within practicality when we were doing this exercise. You can always make a culvert as big as you want to convey a flow, but it doesn't mean it's going to be buildable. When we increased the culvert from 12 by 5 to 16 by 7, there was a 2-foot drop in the water surface elevation, and that's what this picture is depicting here. So you have the culvert, the blue line that passes on over the culvert is the existing conditions. When you expand the culvert, the water surface elevation drops by that 2 feet and is now passable through the culvert. So you avoid that backflooding issue. Now, what does this mean when you're thinking about it, when you're talking to a homeowner? Because 2 feet of water surface elevation may not mean much to them in the culvert. Well, you can remap it. So what we took the information, we remapped the floodplain, and in the existing conditions without culvert improvements, which is in yellow there, you can see there are a handful of homes that are inundated. When you increase the culvert, we reduce the floodplain, and that's what's depicted in the cyan. You see the decrease in floodplain about 1,000 feet upstream of the culvert. So that entire watershed area, or that entire block area, will now be free of flooding. And to give you an idea, like I said, we did these cost estimates. When we put the cost estimate together for this culvert replacement, it was approximately $180,000, which isn't a lot when you're talking about homeowner damage, repeated homeowner damage to FEMA. So I think the cost benefit on this would end up being, to the benefit of reducing flooding for these homes without having to have claims. We also want to make sure when you're doing a project like this, you're not increasing flows downstream and making the flooding worse. In this particular project, the downstream area was an open forest, so there was no increased flood risk downstream. Here's an example of this is the new Windsor wastewater treatment plant. Here's an example of individual property mitigation. So the wastewater treatment plant, because of its function, is generally very close to the river. It's also very far downstream in the watershed. So it's unrealistic to think that we can reduce flows enough in this area to reduce flooding. So for this particular situation, we felt that individual property mitigation is the most appropriate approach. In this case, we're proposing a flood wall that would need to be elevated approximately 12 feet at its highest point to prevent up to the 0.2% floodplain. The wall would tie into high points on each side. This is a significant cost investment. It's about $2.9 million. The majority of the cost is coming from the flood wall itself because flood walls need to have a structure that can actually prevent any kind of hydrostatic pressures, water pressures from pushing it down. They need to be reinforced significantly. So that's where the cost is coming from. In this situation with the wastewater treatment plant, it's unrealistic to think that we can move an entire wastewater treatment plant for any cheaper than that. So this is likely their best option. With the option, you can also have moving doors so trucks can come in and out, and only during storm events will it be fully operable. When designing things like this, you also have to keep in mind that you don't want to create worse flooding issues, like a bathtub effect. So if you had a flood wall, that also means water can't be draining off the site into the river. So these are considerations that need to be accounted for going forward. The last project site that I'll review, this is the paper mill. This is the location of a former paper mill factory. And this is an example of increasing flood storage and reconnecting the floodplain. So that area that's hatched in red is the old footprint of the paper mill. Much of it is just covered with concrete currently, and it's largely disconnected from the storm. You can see the 1% floodplain is not connected to it, and the storm event large enough, the 0.2% does become connected. So in this case, we would propose removing a fair amount of the fill material and reconnecting everything. With this approach, you end up having a 5% reduction in peak flows. 5% may not sound like a huge number, but we're also talking, we're fairly far down in that watershed. It's a large watershed, so it's a significant step. Also, by increasing this flood storage and reconnecting the floodplain, we can actually help decrease potential damages on the left-hand side. So if you look on the opposite side of the river, from where the red hatching is, there's actually a development, and there's a very steep, you can't tell, but it's a very steep slope. Right now the water just has a tendency to be directed right into that slope and slowly eroding away and collapsing, and you can see in some of those gray areas, it's actually where soil has collapsed already. So this mitigation strategy will actually stabilize the stream and prevent any damage from that slope failure. It is, of course, costly because we are removing material. And with that, like I said, that's just a handful of the mitigation strategies that how we applied them, how we evaluated them, and then the cost estimate.
Right, so we want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to answer some questions about the project. I think Anna's been collecting them. We tried to give kind of an overview of the process that we went through and the strategies that we were looking at and how we use the model to evaluate those strategies and their effectiveness. If anybody has any questions, we are happy to answer them.
Thanks very much. We do have a few questions that have come in, and I want to encourage attendees to continue sending them to me, the host or NEIWPCC moderator, via the chat function. First one is, could you say more about how you evaluated the mitigation potential of land protection across the geography?
Yes, I can speak to it. So it was actually an interesting exercise. We went through where we wanted to protect the land. We sort of looked at the reverse situation. So what would happen if that land was no longer preserved and it was developed, which essentially is a loss of storage potential. And so we were, and I can provide more information later, but we had to develop a hydrograph and determine sort of the storage that was available and what would happen in the modeling if that storage was no longer there, no longer available for the flows. And we do have a hydrology and hydraulic report that we can make available if people want to understand, to what detail the modeling provided.
Any other questions, Anna?
Yeah. When you talk about wetlands, do you see a risk to their development, or would federal regulations protect them? And two related questions to that, is the Silver Stream wetland a DEC wetland? Actually, that's, well, and do you find permitting to be restrictive? So
New York is an interesting state when it comes to wetland regulations. Anything greater than, I think it's 12.4 hectares, is regulated by the state. A wetland smaller than that is regulated by the U.S. Army Corps. To the extent that the state and federal regulations protect the wetlands, it's typically project dependent, and it's also dependent on the wetland itself, so whether it's connected to a larger wetland system, it's usually offered more protection. I can't speak to the New York regulations specifically concerning wetlands, but I know just because they are wetland, it doesn't mean they're preserved in perpetuity. I mean, right. Wetland regulations do allow for development of wetlands, but they require mitigation, offsetting, and other types of sort of requirements that will deter development in certain situations, but they do not by default limit or preserve wetlands development in wetlands. The best way to do that is to actively preserve that land and restrict it from those types of land uses going forward. With respect to the Silver Stream wetland question, Anna, I think we would have to, do you remember the ownership off of that?
It was mixed. So part of it was owned by the state, and I believe a fair amount of it was also owned by private entities. And then there are some, I believe there's a solar field proposed on the wetland as we speak. I don't know what the
current status is.
Yeah, the status of it is, but there is potential that it can be developed. It should also be noted that Silver Stream area was an unmapped tributary by FEMA. So anyone, and there's a fair amount of flooding on Silver Stream. So anyone living on Silver Stream actually may not be aware of their flood risk because it's not mapped by FEMA, therefore not eligible for flood insurance.
Not that they're not eligible, yeah. But they would have to go. Anybody who's not familiar with the NFIP requirements, the flood insurance, they're just likely not to know when they go to get a mortgage, they're not going to trigger an automatic requirement because they're not in a mapped floodplain. Just because you're not in a mapped floodplain by FEMA does not mean you do not live in a floodplain or not at flood risk. So anybody is eligible to participate in the NFIP under a preferred risk policy, and it was recommended, I think, that this area looks at preferred risk policies. Anybody that is in an area looking at future risk flood should consider preferred risk policies. Anna, are there any other questions?
Yeah. Christiana indicated that they left that you left the prioritization of the 16 sites up to the communities. Have any of these projects been started or plan to be started?
So we finished the project up early this year. To my knowledge, nothing has been started yet. There have been a couple of grant opportunities available. However, I believe everyone in the town, they tend to get preoccupied and busy and haven't gone forward with the grants. But it's something that myself, the Orange County Planning Department, we regularly bring up the report and send information to the communities. I know Scott Cuppett from the state will often send grant announcements to the group and say, you know what, we have this plan now, here's some grant opportunities. So it's something that has not fallen off of any of our radars because there are a lot of great opportunities. It should be mentioned that the Cornwall wastewater treatment plant, even before we started this study, had a $3 million project to raise their infrastructure. So they were already in the process of making their plant more resilient when we started this project. So resiliency is a topic on all of them being the council members and the mayor's minds that they are moving forward with.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the modeling software that you used?
Yeah, so for the hydraulic modeling, we used HECRAS version 5. HECRAS is a free tool from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and you provide stream geometry information, so general cross-section of what the stream looks like in its floodplain, and flow information, and a handful of other parameters, and it will output water surface elevations and map a floodplain.
Thanks. I want to mention that there's been some interest by participants sending comments that people are interested in seeing the final report, and there is also some interest in seeing the model. What is the availability of both of those things?
The report is available, and Anna, I can send you a final PDF of the model. Sorry, of the
That's
report.
Great. I'll send that out.
Okay. We can also provide the hydrology and hydraulic report. The model itself, I would need to speak with some other entities about sharing.
Okay, thanks. And then a follow-up question about permitting. Quickly, we just only have about a minute left. About permitting in terms of moving earth or excavation in a stream.
So I'm not going to speak to New York rules, but according to FEMA and the NFIP, if you're within a floodway, which is an area defined on the FEMA maps, you can move material, but only if you don't raise your base flood elevation. And that's really the rules they put on there. Now the state likely has more restrictive rules, although some states don't. So, I do a fair amount of work in New Jersey. In New Jersey, you largely couldn't even think about it. But when it comes to restoration, a lot of permitting agencies are also realizing that restoration is not the same as development and shouldn't have the same guidelines as development. So there has been a shift in the thinking when it comes to regulating agencies. I would suggest if there's a project in mind, you reach out to the local DEC regulator, have pre-application meetings, and discuss what the project is and what's possible given the regulations.